Video News, y'all. Say what? KP Video News, y'all. It's time for the news.
That's right, it's time for the news. And I got a congratulations to Charles Brown Jr. and the first black service chief in the U.S. military history confirmed. The Senate on Tuesday confirmed an African-American man to serve as a service chief in the U.S. military for the first time, making a historic moment for the armed forces, which seldom see people of color among the top brass. Vice President Mike Pence presided over the historic 90-0 vote to confirm General Charles Q. Brown Jr. to be Chief of Staff of the Air Force. That's right, it's a black man. Confirmed General Charles Q. Brown Jr. to be the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. A vote that came against the backdrop of a nation simmering with anger and sadness over racial injustice following the death of George Floyd and other black Americans at the hands of police. A few days before his confirmation vote, Brown, who goes by CQ, released a moving, deeply personal video in which he said he was full of with emotion for the many African Americans that have suffered the same fate of George Floyd. I'm thinking about history of racial issues and my own experiences that don't always sing of liberty. He outlined being one of the only African Americans at his school and being the only African American in his platoon and later in leadership. I'm thinking about wearing the same flight suit with the same wings on my chest as my peers and then being questioned by another military member, "Are you a pilot?" he said. I'm thinking about the pressure I felt to perform error-free, especially for supervisors I perceived had expected less of me as an African American. I'm thinking about having to represent by working twice as hard to prove their expectations and perceptions of African Americans were invalid, he said. The U.S. military has long been known for a lack of diversity among its leadership. According to the Pentagon's latest figures, 18.7% of enlisted members of the military are black, but only 8% of the officers are black, compared to 76% of the officers who are white. As the country has been grappling with this complicated racial history, so too has the military. All military service chiefs have in recent days issued statements calling for the need to address the issue of race among the ranks amid the protests triggered by Floyd's death, and the Army is said to be considering renaming nearly a dozen major bases and installations that bear the names of Confederate military commanders. Amid his nomination to be the first African American Chief of Staff, Brown said, "I'm thinking about African Americans that went before me to make this opportunity possible. I'm thinking about the immense expectations that come with this historic nomination, particularly through the lens of current events plaguing our nation. Thinking about how my nomination provides some hope, but also comes with a heavy burden. I can't fix centuries of racism in our country, nor can I fix decades of discrimination that may have impacted members of our Air Force. I'm thinking about how I can make improvements personally, professionally, and institutionally so that all airmen, both today and tomorrow, appreciate the value of diversity and can serve in an environment where they can reach their full potential," he said. After Brown was approved on a voice vote in the Senate Armed Services Committee, his nominations was put on hold by Republican Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, who wanted assurances Brown would support basing the K-6-46 tanker in his state. Sullivan's office did not immediately respond to requests for information about the hold or how it was resolved. Sullivan spoke to the Senate floor Tuesday, praising Brown's qualifications for the job and said he did not realize until recent historic natures of Brown's nomination. I think this is very important. The hell with Sullivan. Anyway, particularly as our country is rolling over the killing of George Floyd and the protests that are taking place peacefully now, which is great, to demand justice for him and his family. And in addition to that story, I found another story about the military data that reveals dangerous reality for black service members and veterans. And it's really, really stark, man. I mean, it's really bad. Top U.S. military officials are seeking to reassure the nation's roughly 2 million active duty and reserve personnel that they are committed to addressing issues of racial inequality, but the challenges they face are huge. A review of data provided by the Pentagon and Department of Veterans Affairs reveals the stark reality that black service members are less likely to become officers and, as a result, are more likely to be seriously injured serving their country than their white colleagues. Those issues are very much intertwined. While there's been some increase in relative numbers in minority officers, it's not been proportional to the increase that we're serving. So therefore, you do have more minority members serving in the front line jobs, and therefore getting higher numbers of injuries and casualties. The data that was reviewed includes a mix of publicly available numbers and records kept by the Department of Defense. Veterans are becoming more diverse. Military veterans are becoming more diverse. Since World War II, the percentage of non-white veterans has increased significantly, reflecting a 35% share of the U.S. military. That was up from maybe about a 15% share that went all the way up to a 35% share. While an overwhelming variety and a majority of service members are still white, the numbers reflect a steady rise in diversity within the military that coincides with the adoption of policies of integration and equal rights for black service members in the wake of World War II. Less than 10% of World War II veterans were minorities, but since then, each veteran cohort has been more diverse than the last. As I said before, of the veterans who served since September 2001, 35% are minorities. Black veterans make up 15% of that, and other minorities make up another 20%. So, while integration policies were adopted by the Army and the Navy well before many states in the South and other American institutions took similar steps, it took years before the changes were enforced, resulting in retention issues for the branches, according to the Department of Defense. Significant support for segregation in the Army continued into the early 1950s, and the service did not complete its integration until 1954, according to the Pentagon. Current and former service members have been quick to point out that even though today's military is significantly more diverse than it's ever been, there are still major challenges to be met. As a society, we are just now hopefully dealing with the original sin and dealing with a lot of underlying issues of race and inequality. So the military has not been isolated from that. And so black service members are underrepresented in the officers' ranks. And so as of today, we have the American population, blacks are at 13%, 15% are minorities of other colors, and 72% of whites make up the population, the American population. But when it comes to the officers, In the military, you got 19% of enlisted men are black. Only 9% are officers. You have a 13% of other minorities that are enlisted. And so I'm gonna revise that. I'm gonna go with the total military numbers. 17% of African Americans make up the total military numbers, and of that 17%, 9% are officers, and 12% of the total military are other minorities, and that makes up 12% of other officers, and 69% of the total military is white, but they make up 76% of all officers. So it's some real discrepancies here that are going on in the military, and black veterans are more likely to sustain severe injuries during service. And black veterans, the veterans are assigned a disability rating to determine how much a service-related injury affects their earning ability and their benefit they should therefore receive. The higher the rating, the more severe veterans' disability. Black veterans are more likely to sustain severe injuries during their service. 45% of injured black veterans have a disability rating of at least 50% compared to 38% for white veterans. And telling you, so it's a real discrepancy. So while our minority communities are shouldering the disproportionate share of service to the country, they are not necessarily being represented in the more senior positions to that same level. Those numbers become even more troubling given the fact that the minority veteran population is projected to increase over the next 20 years, despite the fact that the total number of veterans is expected to decrease over that same period, according to the Veterans Administration. So they expect for minority numbers to go up in the military. Even though the military is expected to get smaller, the numbers of minorities numbers are expected to get higher. So that means that basically what they're saying is that the number of whites that are going into the military is going to decrease over the years as the military decreases in its size, and the numbers of minorities will increase. I wonder why. Does it sound like a plan? Somebody got a plan somewhere. That's how it is. In the land of no-nos.
You know what time it is? Say, do you know what time it is? For the news.
Peace,
Time
folks.
for the news.